The Umbara arc in the Clone Wars is by far some of the best storytelling in the entire series. And it's not just because the action looks incredible in the dark, neon fog of a hostile world. It's because Umbara takes the clones we've grown attached to, especially Captain Rex, and pushes them right up against the breaking point of their own morality. Of course, the whole campaign has huge moments for the 501st, for Fives, for Dogma, and even for the Jedi. But the real emotional core of Umbara is the clash between two very different soldiers standing on the same side of the war. On one hand, we have CT-7567, Captain Rex, who has spent the entire show developing a conscience, a sense of individuality, and a loyalty to his men. On the other hand, we have General Krell, a Jedi who treats clones as expendable assets and eventually reveals a much darker agenda. As I said, this relationship is where Umbara really hurts. Rex is used to serving under generals like Anakin and Ahsoka, who joke with the squad and say things like, "Good job, Captain," instead of "Advance until you're all dead." Krell walks in, rips command away from Anakin, and immediately starts ordering frontal assaults, suicide charges, and tactics that ignore every bit of experience Rex has earned. The tension between duty and conscience starts the moment those orders hit the ground. So here's the central what-if for this video. On Umbara, one word from Captain Rex could have saved hundreds of clones if he'd dared to say it. No. No to the first reckless charge. No to sacrificing his men for Krell's pride. No to turning his blasters on brothers in another battalion. I thought it would be fun to rebuild the entire Umbara campaign around the moment where Rex refuses, out loud, in front of everyone. Now, let's get started. We're going to walk through a complete, ordered retelling of the Umbara arc, but with a re-engineered timeline. Same planet, same battles, same eerie atmosphere, but an early divergence point where Rex pushes back instead of swallowing his doubts. From there, we'll track how that single decision reshapes the chain of command, the survival rate of the 501st, and even who lives long enough to matter later in the war. Now, there will be major spoilers for Umbara, for Rex's later story with Ahsoka, and for some of the bigger Clone Wars payoffs. So, there's your warning. Because if Rex had openly defied Krell, that act of rebellion wouldn't just stop at one foggy battlefield. It could ripple forward into Order 66, the inhibitor chip conspiracy, and even Palpatine's grand plan for the clones as a whole. This is the Umbara campaign you never saw, and we're going to imagine how the entire war changes when the most loyal captain in the 501st finally decides he won't be just a number. So before we throw Rex into open rebellion against a Jedi General, we need to be really clear about how this is going to work. I thought it would be fun to treat this as a full alternate timeline, not just a single, what if he said no moment and then handwave the rest. First, we're going to quickly re-establish the canon Umbara arc. That means going back to Rex's mindset right as the 501st is diverted from a fun, flashy space battle to this pitch-black meat grinder of a planet. We'll see Anakin get pulled away, Krell arrive with his "I don't care about clones" attitude, and those early clashes where Rex is already pushing back but still obeying. As I said, we need that baseline before we can change anything. After that recap, we'll branch. Our organizing principle is simple: strict chronology. We're going to walk through the entire alternate Umbara campaign from the first landing gunships, to the key battles, to the arrest or non-arrest of Krell, and then keep going into the later seasons. So we're not stopping when the fog clears. We're following how this one decision echoes into Fives' chip investigation, Ahsoka's departure, and even the final siege of Mandalore. To keep it grounded, we need some rules. Rex is still Rex. His personality, training, and prior episodes all stay exactly the same. He's still the clone who customizes his armor, respects Anakin, and tells his men, "Good soldiers follow orders," but they can make their own decisions too. The only thing we're changing is his decision point around Krell's orders. Everything else, clone reactions, Jedi politics, separatist responses, even Palpatine's long game, has to follow logically from that fork. Now, there will be major spoilers, and not just for Umbara. We're pulling in Fives' entire inhibitor chip arc, Tup's breakdown, Ahsoka walking away from the Jedi Order, and events from the Clone Wars final season, including Order 66. So, there's your warning. If your only exposure to Krell is the four-armed guy who said you're all expendable, and you haven't seen what happens to Rex and the squad after that, now might be the time to finish those episodes. Structurally, think of this video as doing two things at once. On one level, it's a character study of Captain Rex, testing how far his loyalty can bend before it breaks, and what kind of man he becomes if he draws that line earlier. On another level, it turns the Clone Wars into more of a political thriller, with a clone captain's refusal on one foggy battlefield, threatening to expose the Republic's darkest secrets. Now, let's get started. Now, let's land on Umbara and rewind to where it all begins. So, before we can change what Rex does on Umbara, we have to remember who he already is when he lands there. Captain Rex is a clone of Jango Fett, grown in the vats of Kamino, drilled from birth to be one more rifle in the Grand Army of the Republic. But by the time this campaign happens in the timeline, he's already proven that he is never just CT-7567 standing in a row. The clones were bred to be identical, of course, yet Rex has carved out his own identity, piece by piece. He customizes his armor with tally marks and blue jog eyes, carries those DC-17 pistols, and even the way he stands in front of his men is different. As I said, he's still the perfect soldier on paper, but we can see the commander who thinks for himself, improvises on the fly, and doesn't treat his squad as disposable. We saw this independence early on at Christophsis, fighting alongside Anakin and Ahsoka in that very first Clone Wars episode we ever got. Rex pushes back when Ahsoka calls him Captain in front of the men, and we get that famous experience outranks everything moment. That little exchange is fun, but it also shows us his priorities: respect, chain of command, and protecting his troopers from reckless decisions, even when those decisions come from a Skywalker. Now, there will be major spoilers as we pull in earlier arcs, so there's your warning. On the Rishi Moon and during the defense of Kamino, Rex learns how fragile clones really are. They were dying in droves, and he's the one writing letters home for fallen brothers. That starts to shift him from a number in a spreadsheet to a caretaker of lives. When he later meets Cut Lawquane, the deserter with a family on Salukami, Rex is forced to look straight at the life he was never meant to have. Pattern interrupt for a second. This is the guy who points a blaster at Cut's chest, then ends up sharing dinner with him. That episode quietly breaks the idea that conditioning is absolute. Rex lets Cut go. No chip, no mind control, just a clone choosing mercy over regulations and walking away. Now, let's get started on why that matters for Umbara. Clones are conditioned to obey, but they're not droids. We eventually see Fives defy direct orders during the Inhibitor chip conspiracy, and Echo push back against suicidal tactics even before his transformation on Skako Minor. Rex serves with both of them. He watches that spark of rebellion and doesn't snuff it out. So by Umbara, Rex is in a unique place. He's the loyal captain who trusts the Republic and respects Jedi leaders like Anakin and Ahsoka, yet he's already tested the edges of obedience. That tension makes him the perfect lens for this story. If he keeps following orders, his loyalty turns into a moral failure. If he says no, even once, he becomes the first crack in the system we're about to rewrite. Now that Rex is right on that edge between loyalty and conscience, Umbara throws him the worst possible test: General Krell. The show treats his arrival almost like a horror reveal, and for good reason. This is not Anakin with a blue lightsaber and a half-smile. This is a massive basilisk Jedi who looks like he was built to break clones. Krell towers over the 501st, both literally and philosophically. 4 arms, twin double-bladed lightsabers, heavy armor, and that slow deliberate walk through the foggy trenches of Umbara. The clones were used to Jedi fighting on the front lines with them. Krell stands above them on the ridge, hands behind his back, treating the battlefield like a Digirik board. As I said, visually he makes the troopers look small, and that's exactly how he sees them. His tactical philosophy is brutal from the first episode of the arc. Krell orders mass frontal assaults against fortified Umbaran positions, pushing the clones straight into laser grids, mines, and heavy cannon fire. When Rex or Fives try to raise concerns, Krell brushes them off with cold math. Attrition is acceptable. Objectives matter more than survival. To him, clones are not brothers or individuals. They were assets, numbers on a mission report, easily replaced by the next batch from Kamino. Now, there will be major spoilers for his character, so there's your warning. Umbara isn't just a case of a strict general being tough on his troops. By the time he takes command of the 501st, Krell has already turned toward the dark side. He has had visions of the Jedi falling and the Republic becoming an empire, and instead of resisting that future, he wants in. His secret plan is to impress Dooku by sabotaging the Republic war effort from within, and that means deliberately sacrificing clones to bleed the army dry. We see this in the way he constantly chooses the most costly option. He refuses to use local intel, ignores creative tactics, and punishes initiative. When Fives and the squad suggest flanking or stealth, Krell shuts them down and doubles down on raw numbers. I thought it would be fun to point out that, in a twisted way, he's doing the opposite of what Domino Squad learned on Kamino. He breaks teamwork instead of building it. All of this lands even harder when we contrast him with Anakin. Anakin's leadership is personal and trust-based. He knows his clones by name, praises their creativity, and bends orders when it will save lives. We've seen Rex argue with Anakin before, and Anakin listens. Under Krell, that entire relationship flips. Rex is still captain, still respected by his men, but his new general treats that bond as a problem to be stamped out. So, when Krell assumes command, it's not just a change in voice giving orders, it's a complete moral inversion. The same chain of command that once protected the clones now becomes the weapon used against them. That's what makes Krell the perfect stress test for Rex's conscience. On paper, every order is lawful. On the ground, those orders are morally abhorrent. The next step in our timeline is the moment where that tension finally explodes, and we ask what happens if Rex says no the first time Krell demands a slaughter. On Umbara, that tension we talked about doesn't stay theoretical for long. The second the 501st drops onto the planet, we can feel that this is not just another heroic montage for the boys in blue. The sky is blacked out, the air is thick with mist, and the only real light comes from blaster bolts and explosions cutting through the dark. The clones hit the ground hard. They were trained for every terrain, but Umbara is a sensory nightmare. The plants are alive and hostile. The air is toxic without filters, and even the ground seems to move under their feet. We see Rex immediately slip into that calm battlefield voice, calling out orders, keeping the squad tight, but even he's looking around like this place is wrong. And of course, the native Umbarans are not droids. They're fast, stealthy, using their own tech and the darkness itself as cover. At first, there's at least one comfort: Anakin. He's reckless, but he knows his men. There's that familiar banter with Rex and Fives, that sense that this squad has survived worse. Then the pattern shatters. A gunship drops in, and Anakin is abruptly recalled to Coruscant by the Chancellor. No debate, no explanation. He just has to hand his entire legion over in the middle of an active war zone. Now, let's get started on the real fracture. Pong Krell steps off that gunship and the whole tone changes. He's towering, four-armed, and from the first moment he speaks, he treats the clones as assets, not brothers. Rex is standing at attention, but the camera lingers on his face. There's a tiny pause before he says, "Yes, General." That hesitation is important. As I said, Rex is loyal, but he's not blind. Krell's first major order is where our what-if timeline could realistically branch. He demands a full frontal assault on a heavily fortified Umbaran position, marching straight down a narrow road into massed cannon fire and tanks. Rex suggests flanking maneuvers, using ATRTs, recon, anything to avoid a meat grinder. Krell shuts him down cold, basically quoting, "Experience outranks everything," back at the clone who actually knows this battlefield. They go in anyway. The result is brutal. Troopers are cut down in rows, walkers explode, and we get those quick shots of helmets hitting the ground and names being shouted over comms. Fives is furious, Hardcase is barely holding it together, and Dogma parrots Krell's doctrine about following orders. It's good soldiers follow orders without the chip. Now, there will be major spoilers for later in the arc, so there's your warning, but we already see Rex pushing back. He questions the plan, he proposes alternatives, he even pauses before relaying Krell's commands. I thought it would be fun to focus on those micro moments, because every time Rex looks at another fallen brother, refusal becomes just a little more plausible. By the end of that first assault, the pressure cooker is sealed. Rex is still obeying, but the trust is cracked. The next section is where we ask, what if, at the very next suicidal order, he finally says no? So now we need to pick the exact moment where our what-if breaks away from the canon Umbara timeline. As I said, we're going to move Rex's Defiance up before the friendly fire nightmare and drop it right on top of one more of Krell's walk straight into the meat grinder plans. We're in the command center, that eerie green Umbaran light flickering over holomaps. Outside, you can still hear distant turbolaser fire and the occasional gunship roaring overhead. Inside, the mood is worse. The clones of the 501st are exhausted, their armor still scorched from the last charge. They were already stretched thin in the previous episode, and now the casualty reports just keep climbing. Krell looms over the table, stabbing a clawed finger at the main road leading to the capital. He orders another frontal assault, same avenue of approach, minimal armor, no reconnaissance. In canon, Rex swallows his doubts and salutes. Here, that doesn't happen. I thought it would be fun to pause on that moment and really let the pressure land. By this point, Rex has watched wave after wave of brothers get cut down for meters of ground. He's seen Hardcase's reckless courage, Dogma's blind faith, and Fives' constant arguments about tactics. Every time he's tried to offer alternatives, Krell has dismissed him, calling him clone instead of by name, undercutting him in front of his own squad and shredding morale. Eventually, obedience stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like betrayal. So when Krell barks for another straight-on push, Rex doesn't just nod. He clears his throat and, very quietly, suggests a flanking maneuver through the shadowed canyons, supported by ATRTs and covering fire. We know Rex is capable of this. We've seen him improvise on Geonosis and Camino. He's not being rebellious, he's being a soldier who actually understands the field. Krell turns, eyes narrowing. He labels the idea cowardly, accuses Rex of questioning a Jedi General's judgment, and threatens him with court-martial for insubordination. That's the line. Not just, your plan is bad, but you don't get to think. In that instant, we cut into Rex's head. He flashes back to Cut Lawquane telling him that clones are more than numbers. He remembers Fives refusing to back down on the Citadel, arguing that good soldiers follow orders, but great soldiers know when not to. And of course, there's Anakin, the general who always told Rex to trust his instincts. Those three voices stack up against Krell's booming command. Rex realizes something brutal. If he obeys now, he's not just following orders, he's complicit. The next body pile will be on him. He makes his choice. Rex slowly removes his helmet, sets it on the table, and squares his shoulders. The entire command room goes silent. Even the background chatter of clone officers dies out. Then Rex says, calm but unshakable, "General, I will not carry out that order." That's the word that could save hundreds of clones. No. The question is, what does a fallen Jedi do when his favorite pawn stops moving? For a second, Krell doesn't move. The war room is so quiet we can almost hear the hum of the consoles. This is the clone equivalent of a meteor shower turning into a droid dropship. Everyone expected routine obedience, and instead, Rex just dropped the word that changes the whole battle. No. Krell's eyes narrow first, then his mouth twists. Disbelief hardens into fury as he strides across the deck, each footstep echoing. He looms over Rex, towering, those massive arms folded behind his back in that "I am the war" posture. He reminds Rex, and really the entire squad, that clones are bred to follow orders, not question them, that their purpose is to be the weapon, not the hand that aims it. Rex doesn't flinch. He stands his ground, helmet off, posture still respectful. He addresses Krell as General every time, but he does something we almost never see in this timeline. He pushes back in the open. He cites his duty to protect his men, explains that a frontal charge through Umbaran guns is tactically unsound, that it will waste lives for no strategic gain. He's not refusing war, he's refusing a meat grinder. Now, there will be major spoilers for Umbara here, so there's your warning. We know how many clones Krell is willing to throw away. Rex, in this version, is trying to stop that before it starts. The other clones' reactions sell how unprecedented this is. Dogma looks horrified, almost sick, staring at Rex like he's watching someone rip out their own inhibitor chip on the bridge. Fives and Jesse exchange a quick glance that's equal parts awe and fear, that silent "is he actually doing this" moment. The bridge crew freezes at their stations, Hands hover over controls. No one dares move, because this isn't just a disagreement. This feels like treason. Krell leans in and drops the word treason out loud. He threatens to have Rex arrested on the spot, even executed under military law for disobeying a direct order in combat. For a heartbeat, we can imagine Dogma already rehearsing the firing squad protocol in his head. But Krell hesitates, killing a decorated captain of the 501st right here, in front of every officer and trooper. That risks snapping the leash on the entire battalion. Pattern interrupt. Instead of igniting his sabers, Krell does something colder. He smiles. Krell grudgingly allows Rex to propose an alternative plan. The conditions are brutal. Rex will outline a new assault, he will lead it personally, and any failure, any delay, any extra casualties will be blamed entirely on him. As I said, Krell is turning this into a test, not of tactics, but of control. Now, let's get started on what that alternative plan actually looks like, and how one act of defiance could rewrite the rest of the Umbara campaign. So now we finally see what happens when Rex doesn't just grit his teeth and follow orders, but actually rewrites the entire assault. Instead of that suicidal straight-line charge we saw in the episode, Rex lays out a plan that sounds a lot more like something Anakin or Fives would cook up on a good day. He splits the 501st into smaller, coordinated squads, not this giant blue wall Krell wanted. Fire teams peel off into the bioluminescent forests, using those glowing vines and towering fungal trees as cover. The Umbaran fog, which Krell treated as an obstacle, becomes their ally. Visibility is low, but the clones are trained for this. They were bred for war and chaos, and Rex actually trusts that. As I said, Rex's focus is simple. Don't win by feeding bodies into the grinder, win by outsmarting the enemy armor. He sends one squad forward as a bait element, popping tracer rounds at Umbaran tanks to get them to pivot their turrets. 2 more squads swing wide through the mist, thermal scanners on, moving slow and low. Their whole job is to hit the armor from the flanks, targeting joints, sensor clusters, and those glowing power conduits. Now, there will be major spoilers for the feel of this battle compared to canon. Instead of that chaotic rush under harsh white flares, we get a slower, tenser advance. We hear the comms chatter, Fives calling out, "Arc Squad in position." Hardcase muttering an in-universe joke about how he prefers his tanks extra crispy. Rex isn't shouting from the rear, he's at the front edge of the lead squad, helmet on, DC-17s drawn, marking targets with his own HUD. The forest itself becomes part of the story. Blaster bolts cut through drifting spores, lighting up the fog in pulses of blue and red. Clones duck behind those huge root arches, sprint between patches of glowing moss, and time their moves with the thrum of Umbaran engines. When the flanking teams finally fire, it's surgical. An Umbaran tank staggers, its side plating blown out, then collapses into the undergrowth. The difference in casualties is brutal in its own way, but it's not a massacre. Troopers still fall. One squad loses a man to a hidden Umbaran sniper, another to a mine that flashes purple before it detonates. But entire platoons aren't wiped out in seconds. Medics actually have time to drag wounded brothers back. You can feel morale shift as the clones realize their captain is spending courage instead of blood. Up in the command center, Krell watches the holofeed with those crossed arms and that permanent scowl. The objective is being taken faster than his plan projected, and with far fewer clone losses. That should be good news, but for someone secretly trying to weaken the Republic, it's a quiet disaster. Every tank the 501st disables without losing a dozen men is another line of his hidden timeline being erased. Rex's squads secure the key ridge overlooking the Umbaran base. Anti-air guns are sabotaged, a landing zone is cleared, and the 501st actually has breathing room. When the smoke clears, the casualty report is grim, but not soul-crushing. The men trade tired nods. Some even joke that following Rex instead of the 4-armed executioner might be the only way to survive this war. I thought it would be fun to end this phase on that micro-victory, because now the rumor mill is awake. Whispers spread through the ranks that Captain Rex's way works. So there's your warning. Once clones start believing in a different kind of leadership, Krell's control over this campaign is already starting to crack. So now the 501st has seen that there is another way to fight on Umbara, and that's where things really start to fracture. When Rex refuses Krell's latest suicide order and proves it works, He doesn't just save lives in that one episode of the campaign. He accidentally lights a fuse, running straight through his own squad. The veterans feel it first. Fives, Jesse, Kix, all the clones who have survived Camino, the Citadel, and every horror in this timeline quietly shift their center of gravity toward Rex. In the barracks after the battle, they were sitting on bunks with armor half off, still streaked with Umbaran mud, replaying what happened. Fives mutters that this is what leadership is supposed to look like. Jesse jokes that if Krell had his way, their new designation would be Acceptable Losses Batch 1. Kix, who just spent hours patching up blaster wounds that never needed to happen, looks at Rex with this new, sharper respect. Their captain didn't just follow orders, he chose them. At the same time, Dogma is horrified. For regulation-minded clones, Rex's stand is not inspirational, it's terrifying. In a corner of the mess, over cold ration packs, Dogma and a few like him whisper about what they just saw. If a captain can say no to a Jedi General, what does that do to the entire chain of command? Dogma quotes the regs almost word for word, insisting that obedience is what keeps clones from turning into separatist rabble. One of the others throws in that old training joke, we follow orders, or people die, and this time the punchline lands wrong, because people were already dying under Krell. Now there will be major spoilers for how this kind of thinking plays out later in the war, so there's your warning. For now, we stay in those cramped Umbara barracks where the real battle is suddenly philosophical. Duty to the Republic versus duty to the brother in the bunk above you. Some clones argue that they were bred for one purpose, follow the Jedi. Others point to the body bags stacking up and ask a quieter question. If the Jedi are wrong, are we still bound to walk into a meat grinder without speaking up? Rex is caught right in the middle of this storm. As I said, he knows he crossed a line. In his private corner, helmet on the locker shelf, he stares at the tally marks on his armor and wonders how many more there would be if he had stayed silent. There's fear there, of course. Fear of court-martial, fear of being reassigned, fear of proving every Kaminoan right about clones being dangerous when they think for themselves. But there's also a grim, quiet satisfaction. His men are alive because he trusted his own judgment. I thought it would be fun to highlight these small, character-driven moments, because this is where the 501st stops being a single, unified voice. You can feel the squad splitting into two overlapping camps, those who now measure orders against the lives of their brothers, and those who cling even harder to the rulebook because the alternative is too frightening. And standing above that fault line is Krell, watching, calculating. Now, let's get started on what happens when a four-armed general decides to exploit that division, or when Rex decides to heal it first. Krell does not explode, he recalculates. This is where the whole timeline of Umbara bends into something colder, because once Rex plants that public no in front of the squad, Krell knows that openly executing him would light the fuse on a full mutiny. So, instead, he does what a future Inquisitor would probably applaud. He turns the entire battalion into a pressure cooker. On the surface, Krell keeps Rex in the position of captain. That's important. It lets him walk around saying, "See, I tolerate independent thinking." But now, there will be major spoilers for Rex's sanity, so there's your warning. Every briefing becomes a stage play. Krell starts asking these loaded questions in front of the officers. Tell me, Captain, are you loyal to the Republic, or to the opinions of your brothers? The word brothers drips with contempt, and suddenly every minor tactical suggestion from Rex is dissected, questioned, then overridden. As I said, this isn't about tactics anymore, it's about control. Krell holds these exaggerated lectures where he praises blind obedience, talking about how the most effective clones are those who follow orders without hesitation, without question, without creativity. He never says Rex's name, but the whole room knows who he's talking about. You can practically hear Fives muttering that old joke under his breath. Good soldiers follow orders, and for once it's not funny at all. Then Krell makes his smartest and most dangerous move. He starts rearranging the internal structure of the 501st. I thought it would be fun to zoom in on Dogma here, because Dogma becomes Krell's perfect tool. Dogma and other regulation-obsessed troopers are quietly promoted into enforcement and liaison roles. Officially, they're coordinating between platoons. Unofficially, they're an internal security net, reporting any hesitation, any side conversation that sounds too critical of command. It's Kaminoan conditioning turned inward. Now, let's get started on what that feels like from Rex's point of view. One day, he walks into a briefing and realizes there were 2 other planning sessions he was never invited to. Krell starts handing sealed orders directly to Dogma to relay to the captain. Recon reports skip Rex and go straight to Krell. Aerial support gets reassigned without consulting him. On paper, Rex is still in charge of the 501st. In practice, he's being boxed into a narrow lane where the smallest misstep can be framed as insubordination. Pattern interrupt for a second. This is not the loud, explosive Krell we remember from the episode. This is closer to how Palpatine operates. Smile in public, strangle in private. The clones feel it before they can name it. They were already split into 2 camps. Now, conversations stop when Dogma walks past. Jokes about shinies and reg manuals die out. Even Fives has to choose his words carefully. Eventually, the whole front feels haunted. Not by Umbaran shadow creatures, but by the sense that every order is a test Krell wants Rex to fail. We're in a cold war inside the battalion now, and the next section is where that quiet war finally draws blood. That Cold War finally turns hot in the exact mission that, in canon, breaks the 501st. Now, there will be major spoilers for one of the darkest Clone Wars episodes, so there's your warning before we twist it. In the original timeline, this is where Krell orders what looks like a daring counterattack, and turns it into a slaughter. As I said, in canon, the setup is brutally simple. The clones get intel about an advancing Umbaran force using captured armor. Krell barks for an immediate assault. The troopers charge through the fog, firing at silhouettes they think are hostiles, and only when Rex tackles one and rips off the helmet does he realize he's been shooting at his own brothers. It's the 501st versus the 212th, blue against orange, with Krell treating them like live-fire training dummies. In our rewritten timeline, that memory is already living rent-free in Rex's head as a fear, not a fact. He's refused Krell once, he's seen the General's casualty numbers, and now any urgent order with fuzzy details feels like a trap. When an officer reports unidentified armor moving through a canyon, the room goes quiet. Krell doesn't hesitate. He calls it an Umbaran push and demands a rapid strike before they slip away. Now let's get started on how different Rex is here. Outwardly, he salutes. Inwardly, alarms are blaring. The comm chatter is thin, the visual scans are distorted, and the IFF tags are flickering in and out. Instead of sprinting off, Rex stalls for seconds that feel like hours. He starts quietly cross-checking frequencies, asking Hardcase on Overwatch to zoom in on armor silhouettes, double-checking that those blips aren't broadcasting friendly codes through interference. Fives is immediately at his shoulder. He remembers the supply ship raid. He remembers how close they were to being executed for doing the right thing. And he's not eager to roll those dice again. He still leans in and says what everyone is thinking. Those signatures look cloned to me. Jesse backs him up, pointing out the formation pattern on the scopes. Umbarans don't march like regs, he mutters, quoting one of those dark little in-universe jokes about how you can always tell a shiny by his spacing. Dogma, of course, hears all of this and snaps. To him, they were already one refusal past the line. Questioning Krell in the middle of a battle isn't caution, it's treason. He recites regs, insists that delaying the assault is costing lives, and flat out accuses Rex of putting his personal doubts over the chain of command. The whole squad feels that tension crackle. Blasters are ready, but no one's firing. Then Rex makes the call that changes the campaign. He keys his helmet and orders every trooper to hold fire and verify targets, directly contradicting Krell's demand to engage on sight. The advance slows, helmets lower, and challenge codes ring out through the mist. Instead of a massacre, confused clones from the enemy group answer back with the right countersign. The deception fails. Krell's does not. By saving his men, Rex has just exposed something far worse than a bad intel report, and the next section is where that betrayal finally comes into full view. The second those challenge codes come back correct, the whole battlefield shifts. Blaster barrels dip, helmets tilt, and you can almost feel the 501st realizing in unison that, if they'd fired, they would have gunned down their own brothers. That's not bad intel anymore. That's a setup. Rex orders both squads to hold position and start cross-checking everything. Now, there will be major spoilers, so there's your warning. Air-sea troopers pull helmet feeds, techs start scrubbing sensor logs, and one of the troopers notices something Rex keyed in on earlier. The enemy armor profiles are off by a few digits, just enough to mislabel clone signatures as hostile. That's not something a random Umbaran farmer whips up. Then the pattern interrupt hits. A panicked transmission cuts through the static from another clone unit deep in the mist, swearing they're taking fire from friendlies who insist their IFF tags are separatist. As I said, this is the nightmare version of "who are you calling a separatist?" from that old mess hall joke, except no one is laughing. The two reports line up perfectly. Someone has been flipping the friend or foe tables across the entire theater. Rex doesn't sit on it. He marches straight to the command center with fives, kicks, hardcase, and a handful of officers in tow. The room is this harsh pool of light in the middle of Umbara's darkness, and Krell is standing over the holotable, already planning the next glorious push. Rex lays it out carefully, step by step. Intercepted comms, mismatched armor profiles, the live report from the other unit. He doesn't shout treason. He frames it as two options: catastrophic negligence or deliberate sabotage. That forces Krell to answer. The general turns, folds all four arms, and tries to seize the narrative. He claims the intel was unclear, that the Umbarans are masters of deception, that Rex's hesitation almost cost them the battle. He throws out lines about how clones were bred to follow orders, about how war demands hard choices. On the surface, it sounds authoritative, but we can see it in the helmets. The squad leaders shift their weight. The room gets very still, and doubt starts spreading faster than any virus. Now, let's get started on the part where this stops being a simple argument. Fives steps forward with that stubborn energy we've watched in every episode of his timeline. He produces a recovered Umbaran device and a data chip he pulled from the sensor grid, already sliced with ARC-level access. The logs show the IFF scramble commands, but they originate from inside the Republic command net, routed through Krell's authorization codes. That takes it from fog of war to someone in this room pushed the button. Krell's eyes narrow. The lights flicker against his face, his hands drifting down toward his lightsabers. Every clone in the room realizes at the same moment that this is no longer about tactics or chain of command. It's about who walks out of this bunker alive, and in the next part of this timeline, we see who draws first. Krell's hands don't stop at his belt. They snap down. 4 blades erupt at once, twin double sabers screaming to life, green and blue flooding the cramped command center with this eerie, underwater glow. The clones were trained their whole lives to trust a Jedi silhouette in front of them. Now that same silhouette is a spinning wall of plasma inches from their helmets. Rex moves first, but not with his blasters. He throws an arm out in front of Fives and Dogma. "Hold your fire!" His voice cuts through the hum of the sabers. He's still a soldier of the Republic, still trying to believe this is just another bad episode of Command Friction. He's seen Jedi angry before. He has not seen one draw blades on his own squad. Krell's eyes sweep the room. "You have been compromised," he declares, and his voice is almost calm. "For the good of the Republic, this insubordination must be disciplined." That word, disciplined, lands heavier than a thermal detonator. As I said, this is the moment where duty and conscience finally collide in the Umbara timeline. Then he moves. The nearest trooper doesn't even finish raising his DC-15 before one blue blade takes his rifle, and the returning arc takes him. Another clone lunges in with stun settings, trying to follow Rex's order not to fire first, and Krell just pivots, twin green blades scissoring through armor and console alike. Sparks, smoke, and 2 white and blue bodies on the floor. The room that was arguing tactics 30 seconds ago is now a killing ground. Pattern interrupt here. Remember all those jokes about "good thing we have a Jedi General"? The 501st is watching that punchline cut them down. Rex doesn't get to grieve. He slams his hand onto his wrist comm. This is Captain Rex. Emergency lockdown, code blue, seal all blast doors in and out of the command sector. All units, General Krell is to be contained. Non-lethal if possible. Repeat, non-lethal if possible. He still calls him General. He still can't quite say enemy. Doors thud shut down the corridors. Red status lights flashing. Of course, blast doors mean nothing to a Jedi with 4 blades and no hesitation. Krell hurls his sabers in opposite directions, carving an X through the main exit, then rips the twisted metal aside with the Force, storming into the hallway as panicked clones try to form a perimeter. Now, there will be major spoilers for how terrifying a single Jedi can be when he stops pretending the clones are people. So, there's your warning. Krell turns the base into a maze of ambushes and breaches. He's cutting through bulkheads to bypass sealed doors, dropping into squads from above, batting stun bolts back into troopers who are just following Rex's plea for restraint. Rex is forced into a running battle, directing fire teams from junction to junction. "Stun only if you can, but stop him here," he shouts, because he understands something crucial now. If Krell reaches the surface, he can sabotage air support, artillery, maybe even the entire campaign. And in the next part, we see Rex decide whether a clone can afford to hold back against a Jedi anymore. Now, let's get started on that choice. Rex makes that choice in motion. He doesn't stop to debate philosophy. He starts giving orders. In seconds, the chaos around the command center turns into a plan. He has the base carved up in his head into tight sectors, each one a trap. He routes squads to junctions, sets their DC-15s to stun, and calls for every piece of heavy ordnance they still have. If Krell wants to charge through them, Rex is going to make every hallway a funnel. Now, let's get started on how different this hunt feels. Rex knows that in close quarters, against a Jedi with 2 double-bladed sabers, the clones are dead, so he forbids melee. No hero runs, no tackling Krell. Instead, they layer trip mines in the dark corridors, rig doors to slam shut behind him, and set overlapping fields of fire that will force him where they want him to go. As I said, this is the exact opposite of the cannon fodder tactics Krell used on them. The clones were learning. They dim the lights, use Umbara's weird shadows, and even reroute power so certain walkways collapse under Krell's weight. Fives cracks. Let's see him adapt and survive through that, throwing his own words back at him. I thought it would be fun to show how their creativity becomes their main weapon here. They're not numbers on a board anymore. They're a squad of professionals hunting a fallen general. In the middle of all this, the character tension gets brutal. Dogma stalks through the halls, blaster shaking, muttering that Krell is a Jedi, that this is treason. Every time he passes another unconscious or dead brother, that faith cracks a little more. Fives, on the other hand, is done. He corners Rex, saying outright that they should drop the stun settings and end this before Krell can hurt anyone else. Now, there will be major spoilers for where Fives ends up in the larger timeline. So there's your warning, but this is one of those early moments where he refuses to just obey. Rex holds the line. "We take him alive," he insists. "The Republic needs to see what he's done." That's a huge shift from the good soldier who once followed every Jedi order. He's thinking about evidence, about trials, about the bigger war. Eventually, all those traps herd Krell into the hangar. It's a massive space, full of scaffolding and parked gunships, and Rex has it wired. As Krell storms in, deflecting stun bolts and roaring that they're all traitors, Rex signals an ATRT team hidden up on the catwalks. The walkers drop in fire from above, hammering his legs and forcing him to his knees, just as squads on the floor hit him with synchronized stun volleys. It takes everything they have, but the great General Pong Krell finally collapses, pinned under the boots of the same clones he tried to sacrifice. They drag him to a makeshift cell, binders locked, ray shield humming. Krell just sneers. He tells them they've only delayed the fall of the Jedi and the Republic, that something far greater is coming for all clones. And in the next part, we see how that warning hangs over Rex long after Umbara is over. Krell's warning is still echoing in that cramped cell when Rex does something no clone was ever grown to do. He calls a tribunal on the front lines. No Jedi Council, no Coruscant courtroom, just a ring of exhausted officers standing in a half-collapsed Umbran bunker, trying to decide the fate of a Jedi general while the war is still raging outside. Now, there will be major spoilers for how this changes Rex's whole timeline, so there's your warning. The people in that room matter. We have Rex, of course, at the center. Around him are senior 501st officers, a few surviving Umbaran theater commanders patched in over glitchy hollow, and even Cody's image flickering in and out as he diverts power from a gunship just to stay on the line. They were never trained for this, but they all know they can't just shove Krell in a closet and hope the council figures it out later. Rex feels the weight first. His whole life has been built on trusting Jedi, on serving under generals like Anakin and Ahsoka who treated the clones as brothers. Now, I thought it would be fun to really sit with that contrast. He's the one who refused Krell's orders, he's the one who uncovered the trap, and suddenly he's in a role usually reserved for masters on the council. Judge, accuser, protector of his own squad, they bring Krell in under heavy guard. The ray shield hums, binders locked, and he's still towering over all of them. Rex starts with simple, clear questions. Did you deliberately send clones into friendly fire? Did you sabotage communications with the fleet? Did you intend to defect to Count Dooku? Krell doesn't even bother to lie. He smirks and admits it all, almost proud, and then he twists the knife. He calls the clones property. He says the Republic will discard them the second the war ends, that they're fighting to preserve a system that sees them as numbers, not men. You can feel the room shift. Five's jaw clenches. Dogma, already shaken, looks like he's going to be sick. One officer mutters that it's treason, another that Krell is just saying what the Kaminoans joked about in the barracks. Good soldiers follow orders until they don't need you. It lands hard because, as I said, some part of them has always feared this was true. That's when the tribunal fractures. Some clones demand immediate execution. They lost friends in those meat grinder assaults. To them, justice is a firing line and a shallow grave. A Republic commander worries out loud about the political fallout. What happens when the Senate hears a clone captain put a Jedi on trial? What happens if Palpatine spins this as a mutiny instead of a rescue? Rex cuts through the noise. He insists Krell has to go back to Coruscant alive. Not as a favor, but as proof. Proof that clones can think, can refuse, and can expose treason even in a Jedi robe. Eventually, by a razor-thin margin, the tribunal agrees. They formally record charges of treason, mass murder, and collaboration with the Separatists, and order Krell detained for transport. Now let's get started on the fallout of that choice, because sending a living Jedi traitor back to Coruscant doesn't just save evidence, it lights a political fuse that's going to blow up right under the Jedi Council's feet. That fuse reaches Coruscant in the most boring way possible on the surface, a priority transmission tagged from a battlefield captain. But when the archivists realize it's from Captain Rex, flagged Jedi conduct irregularity, the whole thing gets bumped straight to the High Council before anyone can quietly lose it in a data vault. The packet is brutal. There's Rex's formal report, written in that clipped, precise style we've heard in so many debriefs, only now he's documenting a Jedi ordering mass frontal assaults for no tactical gain. Attached are hollow recordings from helmet cams, showing Krell walking calmly through explosions while clones die around him, and the friendly fire misidentification that was supposed to wipe out an entire squad. Then you have corroborating testimony from Fives, Dogma, Kix, multiple commanders across the 501st. It's not just one clone complaining about a hard general, it's a case file. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Jedi Council's dignity here, so there's your warning. We cut to the council chamber in session, that familiar ring of seats, only the mood is way colder than in any episode where they're debating supply lines. They watch Krell's sneer on repeat as he calls the clones expendable. They see Rex, helmet off, refusing to carry out an execution order on his own brothers. The silence after the holocuts is long enough that you can almost hear the Coruscant traffic outside. Obi-Wan is the first to really break it. He's not arguing the facts. He's staring at what this will do to morale. If word spreads that a frontline Jedi not only fell, but had to be arrested by his clone captain, what does that do to every other battalion that trusts their general with their lives? Of course he's thinking of Cody, of the 212th, of all the squads who already whisper about hard commanders behind the mess hall doors. Mace Windu goes a different direction. He's locked on the precedent. a clone refusing a Jedi's order, placing a Jedi under arrest, and then being vindicated by a tribunal? That's not just a battlefield anomaly. That's a legal crack in the entire chain of command. As I said, the clones were bred for obedience, but they're not droids. If one captain can do this and be right, where does the Council draw the line next time? Yoda, of course, is the quietest and the most troubled. He feels in this report the same rot he sensed when Fives died on Coruscant. War twisting the Order, turning Jedi into tools, and now those tools snapping in different directions. I thought it would be fun to say this is just one bad Jedi, but Yoda knows better. Krell is a symptom, not the disease. Now the Council has an impossible choice. Publicly acknowledge Krell's betrayal, which validates Rex's defiance and tells every clone in the Grand Army that a Jedi can be lawfully overruled. Or they bury it, seal the records, and quietly reassign the 501st while telling the Senate it was an unfortunate combat stress incident. Either way, trust is bleeding out, and that's the real shift. From this moment in our timeline, the clones know, not in theory, but in hard holo footage, that a Jedi can be wrong and a clone can be right. That realization is not going back in the box, and in the next section, we'll see how that changes the battlefield long before Order 66 ever hits. From that moment on the ground, we have to pull the camera back up to the Chancellor's office, because if there's one person who is absolutely smiling at this mess, it's Sheev Palpatine. A Jedi exposed as a traitor, and a clone captain who defied him and turned out to be right? For a Sith Lord running a war on optics as much as blasters, that's a propaganda goldmine. Now, there will be major spoilers for how Palpatine plays both sides of this, so there's your warning. Publicly, he cannot afford to lose face. Krell's fall technically weakens Dooku's assets, since Krell was trying to jump ship to the Separatists, but Palpatine is a master of turning losses into leverage. He steps in as the concerned but proud leader, making sure every Holonet report frames Umbara as a story of loyal clones saving the Republic from a corrupted Jedi. So we get the speech. I thought it would be fun to imagine the exact wording because we know the pattern from other episodes. Palpatine calls Rex a model soldier of the Grand Army and praises his unshakable loyalty to the Republic and the Jedi Order. Notice what he's doing there. He holds Rex up as the ideal, not because Rex obeyed a Jedi, but because he had the courage to expose one. In front of the Senate and the public, Clone Agency quietly steps over Jedi authority. As I said, that's just the surface. Behind those closed council chamber doors, Palpatine shifts gears. With the Jedi, he's the sympathetic ally. He tells them this was an isolated incident, a tragic anomaly, and reassures them that the clones remain obedient and respectful. He plays into their guilt, suggesting Krell's fall is proof they need to look inward rather than blame the troops. It sounds supportive, but it keeps them second-guessing themselves. At the same time, he's whispering something very different to senators and admirals. Umbara becomes Exhibit A in quiet committee meetings about direct oversight of Jedi commanders. If one general could go rogue, who's to say others won't? Shouldn't the military have clear authority to countermand Jedi orders in the field? Shouldn't the Senate have more say in deployments? He never outright attacks the Order. He just nudges the Republic toward a mindset where the clones and officers, not the Jedi, are the real guardians of security. This accelerates tensions that were already there. The Jedi feel scrutinized and defensive, suddenly aware that every battlefield decision might be replayed on the Holonet. The clones, seeing Rex honored for thinking for himself, feel emboldened to trust their own judgment. The whole war tilts a little closer to a purely military timeline, where moral debates give way to efficiency reports. So, in losing Krell as a future Inquisitor-type asset, what does Palpatine gain? Something far more valuable: a wedge. Jedi and clones no longer move as one squad in the public imagination. When the time comes to broadcast that the Jedi have betrayed the Republic, he can point back to Umbara and say, "We've seen this before." And in the next section, we'll see how that wedge changes the rest of the war long before Order 66 ever activates a single chip. That wedge we talked about doesn't just sit in some Senate report. It travels, story by story, bunk to bunk, until suddenly Captain Rex isn't just a name on a roster, he's a legend. And legends are dangerous in an army built on obedience. Among the clones, the tale of Umbara spreads faster than a mess hall rumor. Some battalions hear, Rex stood up to a Jedi, got Krell arrested, and saved his squad. and they were inspired. ARC troopers on Camino quietly tell cadets that their lives matter, pointing to Rex as proof that you can question a suicidal order and still be a good soldier. Others react with pure fear. In more rigid units under generals like Krell used to be, the commanders double down on discipline, warning that defiance will only bring shock collars, demotions, or worse. Now, there will be major spoilers for how the Jedi react, so there's your warning. Inside the Order, it's almost a council-wide Rishi eel in the room. Anakin and Ahsoka are proud. This is the same captain who already showed initiative on Camino and the Citadel, and they see Umbara as the natural evolution of that independent streak. To them, Rex proved the clones aren't droids, but more rigid masters. The Ki-Adi-Mundi and Krell types whisper that this sets a terrifying precedent. If one clone captain can say no and be vindicated, what happens the next time a battle turns messy and half the line decides their general is wrong? Rex himself hates all of this attention. He didn't refuse Krell to become a symbol. He did it because his men were dying in droves. Now he walks into hangars and conversations stop. Clones nudge each other and murmur. That's him, the one who told a Jedi no and walked away breathing. As I said, he has always been more individual than most, with painted armor and his own code. But this is different. Being the first clone to openly challenge a Jedi and be proven right feels less like a medal and more like a target on his chest. I thought it would be fun to follow him on a few visits to other ships. On a Venator above some forgotten Outer Rim rock, Rex leans against a barracks doorway, talking quietly with a nervous sergeant. He tells them to think, to remember that they're fighting for the Republic, not for any one general. But he also warns that defiance is the last resort. You don't look for a reason to disobey, he says, echoing what Fives once told him. You look for a way to make the Order work without throwing lives away. Now, let's get started on how this changes Rex internally. Umbara hardens his personal code. Loyalty to what's right now outranks loyalty to any single Jedi, even Anakin. He'll still salute, still follow the chain of command, but there's a new line in his mind that no general is allowed to cross. And when that line is tested again, during a little thing called Order 66, that quiet, hardened belief is going to decide who lives, who dies, and who disappears into the shadows next. And that belief doesn't stay locked on Umbara. It walks off that shadow world with Rex, straight into his partnership with Ahsoka. The 2008 Clone Wars show is by far some of the best Star Wars content out there, and one of the best aspects is of course the actual clones and how they bounce off their Jedi. Rex and Ahsoka are one of the clearest examples of that, and in this altered timeline, Umbara becomes the quiet legend sitting between them. In canon, they were already close. From the Ryloth episodes to the Citadel, Ahsoka trusts Rex's judgment so much that she'll adjust her own plans around it. As I said, she knows he's not just a good soldier, he's a good man. Now add the story every clone in the 501st whispers about. The day Rex told a Jedi general no, arrested him, and saved an entire squad from walking into a meat grinder. When Ahsoka hears the full Umbara story in this version, that respect hardens into something almost unshakable. I thought it would be fun to zoom in on a small moment. Picture a quiet hangar after a rough mission, maybe between episodes during the later seasons. The gunships are cooling down, the chatter is fading, and Ahsoka and Rex are doing that standard post-mission walk and talk. She finally asks what everyone else jokes about but never really digs into. Captain, how did it feel to stand up to a Jedi general? There's a beat. Rex, who has faced Umbaran fighters, droid armies, and Krell's double-bladed sabers, admits that was the most terrifying thing he has ever done. He explains that every bit of Camino training screamed at him to obey, but watching his men die for nothing was worse. Protecting his squad meant disobeying the very system that created him. That's our pattern interrupt, because we usually think of clones as the ones who never hesitate. Ahsoka listens, and we can almost hear Five's old line, echoing in the background about, "We're not droids." Now, there will be major spoilers for her own arc, so there's your warning. This conversation hits her at a vulnerable angle. Ahsoka is already wrestling with doubts about the Council, about the war, about how often civilians pay the price. When she remembers Rex drawing a line on Umbara, she sees a mirror of the moral courage she's going to need during her trial, when the Council turns on her, and later when she walks away from the Order. If a clone can say no to a Jedi for the right reasons, what excuse does she have to stay silent when the Jedi fail their own ideals? From that point on, their shared skepticism of unquestioned authority becomes a core part of their dynamic. It's not cynical, it's focused. They still respect Anakin, they still salute the Council, but there's this unspoken agreement between them that orders are only sacred if they're just. That's exactly why, when everything falls apart during Order 66, Ahsoka will trust Rex implicitly. She doesn't just trust his aim or his tactics, she trusts that if something feels wrong in his gut, he will fight it, even if it kills him. And Umbara, in this version of the timeline, doesn't just stay a horror story filed under that one brutal campaign. It becomes a case study. Future Jedi and clone officers whisper about it in mess halls and war rooms. How far can a clone go in challenging a general? What responsibility does a Jedi have to listen when their troops push back? Now, let's get started on how that case study collides headfirst with Palpatine's master plan. Because the next time the chips are down, they're literal inhibitor chips. Now, there will be major spoilers for Five's entire endgame here, so there's your warning. In the canon timeline, after Umbara, Fives moves from battlefield hero to accidental whistleblower. It starts with Tup's breakdown in the middle of a mission, when he suddenly executes Jedi Master Tippler while muttering about good soldiers and orders. That one moment shatters the illusion that the clones are just loyal soldiers following their training. From there, we watch Fives get pulled into a medical mystery. He goes with Tup to Kamino, pushes past Kamino in secrecy, and discovers the inhibitor chips buried in every clone's brain. These chips are passed off as safety measures, but Fives slowly realizes there's something far more sinister. He confronts Nala Se, he questions Shaak Ti, and he keeps trying to connect this strange programming to a larger plot that no one wants to see. Eventually, Fives takes his case all the way to Coruscant. He escapes supervision, grabs hard evidence, and tries to warn both the Jedi and the Chancellor himself. In that haunting plaza scene, he's drugged, cornered, and branded unstable. The clones that were once his brothers surround him with blasters raised, and he dies in Rex's arms with his final warning about a grand conspiracy barely understood and immediately buried. Now, I thought it would be fun to upgrade that story using our altered Umbara. In this new timeline, when Tup snaps and Fives starts digging, he isn't just some overzealous Aark in the eyes of the brass. He has a crucial ally he never had before, a Captain Rex who has already defied a Jedi General, exposed Krell's treason, and seen a dark plan unfold from the inside. As I said earlier, Umbara turned Rex into a living case study in justified disobedience. So when Fives comes to Rex with talk about hidden chips and secret programming, Rex doesn't hesitate. He believes him. He remembers Krell's cold willingness to throw clones into meat grinder assaults, his switch to the Umbarans, and that line about betting on the winning side. Rex helps Fives catalog Tup's behavior, secure medical scans, and document every inconsistency in the Kaminoan's story instead of just telling him to stand down. That changes how the Jedi react. Rex personally vouches for Fives' sanity to Anakin and Shaak Ti, reminding them that this is the same trooper who survived the Citadel and Umbara without cracking. He references Krell directly as proof that something is rotting beneath the surface of the war. If one Jedi could fall so far, why couldn't there be a deeper manipulation targeting the clones themselves? Now, let's get started on how that joint investigation plays out. With Rex present in briefings, asking precise questions, the rush to dismiss Fives as delusional slows down. Shaak Ti insists on more controlled testing. Anakin, already skeptical of authority, pushes for direct oversight instead of leaving everything to Nala Se. The Kaminoans feel the pressure, and Palpatine has to move faster and more aggressively to shut this down. In the plaza on Coruscant, it's no longer just one frantic ARC trooper shouting about a plot. It's Fives backed by a decorated captain with the Umbara file in his pocket. Palpatine can still frame events, of course, and Fives can still fall, but the combination of Umbara's precedent and Fives' evidence makes the truth heavier, stickier, much harder to bury completely. Rumors spread through the ranks, a few medical techs quietly copy files. Ahsoka, out on the fringes, will have a lot more to work with when the chips finally activate. And that's where this starts to snowball, because once the idea that good soldiers can be reprogrammed is out in the open, Order 66 does not land the same way for everyone. So once Krell's treason is dragged into the light and the inhibitor chip rumors start circulating, the Jedi Council runs into a problem they cannot meditate away. They can't unknow that a respected Jedi general turned on his own clones in the middle of a campaign and tried to flip the entire war to the Separatists. Up to this point, the idea that a Jedi could fall in the middle of the Clone Wars is mostly an abstract fear. Now there will be major spoilers for later Council dynamics here, so there's your warning. With Krell publicly tried for treason, it becomes a case file, not a cautionary tale. They have testimony from Rex, Fives, Dogma, full battle recordings, and a dead Umbaran population to point at. The dark side isn't just a Sith problem out there somewhere. It's in their own ranks, feeding on the exact moral compromises the war keeps demanding. That changes the tone in the High Council chamber. When they sit down to talk about the Chancellor's emergency powers dragging on, or his seat in the Jedi Temple, Krell is the unspoken third presence in the room. Yoda can no longer wave away the clones' unease as simple fatigue. As I said, they were bred to obey, and even they mutinied against a Jedi. That hits hard when you're debating how far to go along with a politician who keeps asking you to bend your own code. I thought it would be fun to imagine one of those quiet council sessions. Windu is pushing that they must keep command of the army, because who else can ensure honor on the battlefield? Obi-Wan, a little more tired now, answers with something like, "We said that on Umbara too." You can almost hear Fives in the background. Good soldiers follow orders. The room goes still. If one of their own used that exact loyalty to turn clones into weapons against each other, what happens if someone higher than Krell is doing the same thing on a galactic scale? So, there's your warning sign baked into every later debate. Yoda starts nudging for more internal oversight, pairing masters together on sensitive campaigns, rotating generals off the front for reflection, checking battle plans that lean too hard on expendable clones. Plo Koon argues that they should eventually consider stepping back from direct command roles altogether, returning to being peacekeepers while a civilian body runs the war. Now, let's get started on how dangerous that sounds to Palpatine, because from his perspective, this is either a delay or a deadline. If the Jedi slow the war, investigate their own, and question the chips, his Order 66 timeline gets messy. So he can't just sit there and quote, "I am the Senate," forever. He has to accelerate events, push Anakin harder, tighten his grip on the courts, and make sure no more Krell-style scandals reach daylight. Umbara becomes a ghost in that council chamber. Every time they vote, they're really asking, are we walking toward the light or toward another Krell? And in our altered timeline, that question is going to collide with one more brutal test they never saw coming. That brutal test lands hardest on one clone in particular, Dogma. Now, there will be major spoilers for his whole arc on Umbara, so there's your warning. Dogma is the regulation-obsessed trooper of the 501st, the guy who treats the Kaminoan handbook like a holy text. For him, Krell walking in isn't a problem, it's a dream assignment. As I said, Dogma idolizes Krell. Where Fives questions, Dogma salutes. Where Rex hesitates, Dogma is already repeating the order word for word, almost Echo style. In canon, that makes him a tragic figure, because he sees any questioning of orders as betrayal. When he pulls his blaster on his own brothers to enforce Krell's commands, he really believes he's being the good soldier they were all bred to be. But in this altered timeline, Rex refuses to let good soldiers follow orders be the end of the story. When Krell is exposed and arrested earlier, Dogma's world doesn't just crack, it implodes. His hero is unmasked as a traitor, a dark side pawn who treated the 501st as expendable. Dogma is forced to replay every moment he barked Krell's orders, every time he dragged a brother into the firing line, and realize he helped make those casualties happen. That's the psychological collapse. The clone who never doubted suddenly can't trust his own thoughts. He's the one in the corner of the barracks staring at his helmet, wondering what his life means if follow every order is no longer the answer. It's almost the inverse of that old 501st joke, at least the general's crazy, not us. Here, Dogma is terrified that he's the one who's broken. This is where Rex steps in. I thought it would be fun to mirror Domino Squad's story a bit, so Rex takes a personal interest in Dogma the same way 99 once did with those defective cadets. Instead of punishing him or shipping him off to some maintenance squad, Rex sits him down and gives him a new metric. You're not just a number, you're a brother. Orders matter, but the men standing next to you matter more. Over time, Dogma redirects that desperate need for structure into a different code. Now, he's memorizing casualty lists instead of regulations, holding himself accountable to the clones he fights beside. His loyalty shifts from any one general or doctrine to the ideals the Republic is supposed to stand for: protecting the innocent, defending each other, refusing pointless slaughter. He still loves rules, but now he asks, does this order fit the mission and our values? Umbara, in this version, becomes a crucible where Dogma and others start to redefine what a good soldier really is. Not just someone who executes commands, but someone who can say no when those commands betray the very reason they were created. And that new definition is going to matter a lot when the next impossible order comes down from on high. Now, let's get started on what that new definition actually does to the rest of the war. Once Rex walks off Umbara with that mindset, every mission after becomes a test case. He's still the same disciplined captain, but now he's the guy who hears a high casualty order and immediately starts running alternatives in his head. Instead of defaulting to "yes, General," he's quietly asking, can we do this with fewer bodies on the line? That push turns into a pattern. Surgical strikes, clone-led recon, and intel gathered by the people actually on the ground. We can see this really clearly on campaigns like Ryloth. In the original timeline, the clones were already careful around civilians. Here, Rex takes that to another level. When he's told to clear a town that might be harboring droids, he doesn't just march in. He has his squad sweep with scanners, send in a small team to talk to locals, and demand an updated site rep before heavy armor rolls through. As I said, he's not refusing to fight, he's refusing to fight blind. It's the difference between shelling a street and using a stun-heavy breach to keep Twi'lek families out of the crossfire. During sieges, this shows up in how he handles vague directives. A Jedi says, "Hold at all costs," and in this version, Rex politely nails down what that means. Does it mean hold the bridge, or hold the city? Are they protecting a retreat, or buying time for intel to upload? He turns those big, dramatic lines into clear rules of engagement that his clones can actually survive. I thought it would be fun to imagine him quoting fives under his breath. Good soldiers follow orders. Good commanders explain them. Other commanders start to notice. Cody has always respected Rex, so when he sees the 501st coming out of brutal fights with fewer body bags, he asks questions. Wolf, still carrying trauma from losing men under Plo Koon, quietly adopts Rex's habit of double-checking GAR intel against what his scouts report. They were still obedient, they just become thoughtful about it. Over time, this spreads into a low-key culture shift in the ranks. Squad leaders compare notes on how to push back without crossing the line. How to say, "General, with respect, that's not the best use of my men." Now, there will be major spoilers for the emotional side of this. This doesn't magically fix the war. Planets still burn, friends still die, and heroes like Echo and Fives still face impossible choices. But there are fewer senseless losses. Fewer "charge that gun line because the chart said so" moments. Clones start to feel that their lives and decisions matter, that they're not just numbers marching toward a pre-written ending. So, there's your warning for what's coming, because this evolving clone culture of thoughtful obedience is on a collision course with the one command that allows no questions, no clarifications, and no conscience: Order 66. So, there's your warning, because when that one command finally comes down, it doesn't hit a blank slate army anymore. It slams into a galaxy of clones who have already watched a Jedi General turn on them on Umbara, and who have already heard Fives die, trying to explain that something was wrong in their heads. Now, there will be major spoilers for the end of the Clone Wars here, so there's your warning again. Across the galaxy, we still get that familiar scene in this timeline. Palpatine leans toward his comlink, that calm, almost bored voice, cutting through the chaos of 1,000 battlefields. The time has come. Execute Order 66. Hidden programming flares to life. Inhibitor chips surge. And squads that were just covering their generals a second ago suddenly pivot, raise rifles, and fire. Normally, that's the whole story. But here, the mental battlefield is already crowded. These clones have Umbara in their memory banks. They remember Krell throwing them into meat grinder charges. Remember that a Jedi can be terrifyingly wrong, and still, somehow, worth saving from themselves. They remember Rex and his men arresting Krell instead of just gunning him down. That creates this weird paradox in their conditioning. Jedi can fall, Jedi can be questioned, Jedi can also be protected. So when the chip snaps into place, it's not pushing through clean obedience. It's smashing into doubts, late-night barracks arguments about fives, and that one trooper who muttered, "What if he was right?" We start to see tiny cracks. A trooper's finger pauses on the trigger for half a heartbeat. A commander repeats the order out loud, as if he's trying to convince himself. One squad mishears and takes a step to secure the perimeter instead of firing, giving their general just enough time to dive for cover or reach a ship. I thought it would be fun to lean into those micro moments. On some worlds, the purge looks almost the same. On others, it's messy. A Jedi senses the hesitation, pushes a clone back with the Force, and bolts. A battalion stalls, asking for confirmation, and that 30-second delay becomes the difference between a dead master and one more fugitive who will eventually cross paths with Rex. And then, of course, there's Rex himself. As I said, he's already more independent in canon. In this timeline, Umbara and Krell have carved even deeper grooves into his mind. When the chip hits, it still seizes him hard. He drops the helmet. His hands shake. Those brutal, absolute words. Execute Order 66. Slam into memories of another absolute order he refused on Umbara. Instead of a slow build, his mind goes to war with itself instantly. Krell's betrayal, Fives' warnings, his own decision to stand between a Jedi and a firing squad, all of that crashes against the chip's command. The struggle is faster, uglier, more violent than we saw in the show. And that means when Ahsoka reaches for him this time, she's not just fighting a buried program. She's grabbing hold of a captain who is already, desperately, trying to claw his way back out. But that also means the window to save him is shorter, and the cost of failure is so much higher. That shorter window changes everything. In canon, Rex barely claws out a "find him" Fives before the chip slams down, and Ahsoka has to piece the whole thing together while clones are literally at the door. Here, because of Umbara, because of Krell, that internal war explodes faster and hits Ahsoka in the face. Now, there will be major spoilers, so there's your warning. In the original timeline, Ahsoka discovers the chip only after Rex manages that tiny moment of resistance during Order 66, and even then, the procedure happens with him half gone, half programmed, fighting her and the droids. In this version, when the order hits, he doesn't just hesitate. He drops his blasters, staggers, and we see him shaking his head, muttering, "Not again, not Krell, not my men," before the tears start. That's the first thing Ahsoka notices. This isn't the calm, loyal captain suddenly turning on her. This is a soldier having a breakdown in the middle of the hangar. As I said, we know Rex is emotional in canon, but here his pleas are fragmented, panicked, almost Camino Medbay level. He's choking out Five's name, Krell's name, begging some invisible commander to call it off, as the clone squad behind him raises their rifles. It's horrifying, but it also gives Ahsoka something to grab onto. Pattern interrupt for her and for us. Instead of immediately deflecting and running, she force shoves the whole firing line back, drags Rex into the medbay, and locks the door before he fully flips. I thought it would be fun to lean into the chaos of the Star Destroyer here. Alarms are blaring, gunships are launching, Maul is loose, but the chip removal happens a few precious minutes earlier than in the episode we know. That means Rex is under for less time, the search parties are a little less organized, and when he wakes up, they actually have breathing room. Now, let's get started on what that changes for Rex. Waking up without the chip, with Krell and Fives at the front of his mind, he doesn't need Ahsoka to connect the dots for him. He realizes instantly that this is the endgame of the conspiracy they were circling for years. Tup's breakdown, Fives dying in his arms on Coruscant, Krell casually throwing clones into meat grinders for the Republic. It all snaps into place as one design. And that clarity hits early enough that his first instinct isn't just escape, it's damage control. He and Ahsoka have a little more time to plan, to slice into the ship's comms, to try coded messages to other captains who might be wavering the way he did. How many more lives can they pull back from the brink in those extra minutes? Do we see a few helmets stay on the floor instead of marching to the gunship bay? That's the question this earlier awakening opens up, and it's going to ripple far beyond one falling Star Destroyer. Those ripples don't just stop with Rex and Ahsoka on one falling Star Destroyer. If Rex plants that seed of resistance back on Umbara, we have to ask, which other clones start to feel it tugging at their thoughts when Order 66 hits? Now, let's get started with the obvious candidates, the clones who were right there in the mud with him. Jesse, Kix, Dogma, Hardcase before he died. Even the nameless troopers who watched Krell walk over bodies without blinking. They were the squad that already practiced saying, "This doesn't make sense, sir," long before the chip ever tried to hijack their brains. As I said, repetition matters. Every time they questioned Krell, they were carving out tiny mental escape routes the chip has to fight through later. Think about Jesse in this altered timeline. He's the one who argued tactics, who stood up to Krell's face and got thrown in the brig. Under Order 66, that same clone is lining up a shot on a Jedi he's fought beside for years. The chip is screaming execute, but his Umbara memories are screaming check the intel. So maybe his first burst goes wide. Maybe he slips on the gunship ramp, or his DC-15 overheats at the worst possible moment, buying a Jedi Master 3 seconds to dive into cover. That's all it takes for one more lightsaber to vanish into the smoke instead of hitting the floor. Kix is another big one. He's the medic, the one who patched up Fives and heard way too much about something wrong in our heads. Now, there will be major spoilers, so there's your warning. When the order comes through, Kix's hands move on autopilot, but his training and his doubts collide. He's the guy who can stall with medical jargon. "General, your vitals are unstable. We need to get you to cover." On paper, he's obeying. In reality, he's dragging a Jedi away from firing lines, turning lethal kill zones into chaotic triage corridors where not every shot lands. Dogma is the tragic flip side. In the show, he was the rule follower who executed Krell once the truth came out. In this version, he's already lived through Rex, proving that obedience can be wrong. The chip still slams into him hard, but when he aims at a Jedi, his finger hesitates just long enough for someone else's bolt to hit first, or for the target to escape the kill box. He doesn't become a hero, he becomes a crack in the perfect machine. Over time, those cracks connect. I thought it would be fun to imagine a tiny, scattered underground forming earlier than in canon. Not a grand clone rebellion, but a fragile whisper network of troopers who malfunctioned during the Order and survived. A sergeant on Felucia who missed his shot, a pilot near Saleokami who flew the wrong pursuit vector on purpose, a comms tech who forgets to forward a Jedi's last known coordinates. They were the ones who heard Fives ranting on Coruscant, who fought under Rex on Umbara, who start quietly comparing notes about headaches, blackouts, and orders they can't fully remember. Of course, the chips are still brutally effective. 99% of clones still fire. Whole battalions still turn on commanders they trusted. This isn't some alternate history where the Republic shatters the plot overnight. What we're seeing instead is proof that the potential for resistance was always there, baked into the same individuality that gave us Domino Squad in the first place. One refusal on Umbara doesn't stop Order 66, but it does show, in a way the Kaminoans never wanted, that the clones were never just mindless pawns. Given the slightest chance, they were always capable of a different choice. And that idea is going to matter a lot when we look at how the post-war galaxy treats the surviving clones, and who they decide to become once the war they were bred for is over. So if clones were always capable of a different choice, the Empire's first question is simple and terrifying. What happens if that choice spreads? Now, there will be major spoilers for how the early Empire thinks about clones, and especially Rex, so there's your warning. From the Imperial side, Rex is not just another veteran who slipped through the cracks. On Coruscant, in some cold ISB archive, there's a thick, red-flagged file on CT-7567. It starts with commendations. Captain of the 501st, decorated in almost every major campaign, trusted by Anakin Skywalker himself. Then the tone shifts. Umbara. Clone Captain openly challenges a Jedi General, participates in the arrest of Pong Krell. Coruscant, same captain backs a conspiracy whistleblower named Fives against Kaminoan and Jedi assurances. Final entry, unit presence confirmed during Order 66, subject then vanishes from all official records. From an Imperial intelligence perspective, that is a horror story in slow motion. This is a clone who proved, on paper, that he can disobey a Jedi, side with a defective trooper, and then disappear when the Emperor needs absolute control. As I said, it's not just that Rex is dangerous in a firefight. He's dangerous as a story. He's living proof that clones can say no. Now, I thought it would be fun to flip the usual perspective. We always watch Umbara through Rex's eyes, but imagine a young ISB analyst reading that file after the war. They were raised on tales of glorious Jedi traitors and noble stormtroopers. Then they see Umbara and the Fives incident laid out as a pattern. Clones who question orders, clones who investigate chips, clones who arrest their own Jedi general. That analyst is not laughing along with good soldiers follow orders. They're writing recommendations. Those recommendations would hit policy fast. We already know the Empire eventually phases out clones, but here that timeline accelerates. Early Imperial directives would cite Umbara as a textbook example of clone over-individuation, and Fives as proof that Kaminoan safeguards failed. The memo practically writes itself. Transition to human stormtroopers, citizens raised under conventional Imperial indoctrination, no Kaminoan ethics, no mysterious chips that can glitch, just fear, propaganda, and loyalty to the Emperor. That shift bleeds straight into propaganda. Publicly, the Clone Wars become a hazy, heroic prelude. Clones are framed as experimental soldiers, effective but flawed, unstable, too close to their Jedi commanders. Stormtroopers are presented as the real ideal, loyal citizens defending order. The moral complexity of the war, Fives on Coruscant, Rex on Umbara, even Krell's treason, gets scrubbed. No posters of a clone captain arresting a Jedi. No holodramas about a trooper shouting, "I'm not just another number." And that's the cruel irony. Rex's refusal on Umbara, in this timeline, doesn't just save his men. It convinces the Empire that men like him can never be allowed to exist again. His choice becomes the justification for a colder, more impersonal war machine, one that doesn't rely on brothers who might grow a conscience, but on faceless recruits who can be replaced by the millions. But if the Empire is working that hard to erase clones like Rex, what happens when the surviving clones start writing their own story instead? Now we jump forward to a very different battlefield. Silence. Rex survives, but in this timeline, he's not just a soldier on the run after Order 66. He's the clone who once said no to a Jedi, stopped a massacre on Umbara, and still watched the galaxy burn. In canon, Rex's guilt is already crushing. He blames himself for the war, for every brother he couldn't save, for nearly killing Ahsoka under the chip. Now, there will be major spoilers for his emotional state, so there's your warning. In this altered timeline, that guilt gets twisted. He knows that defiance can work. He's seen Krell fall, he's seen a Jedi arrested on the strength of clone testimony, and yet Sidious still wins. That knowledge sits heavier than any pauldron. We find him in hiding between episodes, in all those quiet gaps the show skips. Small campfires on backwater worlds, long hyperspace jumps in stolen freighters. He's staring at the bulkhead, running the same mental loop. Umbara, Fives on Kamino, the hangar on Coruscant, Order 66. He replays Fives grabbing him, shouting about chips and a plot, and now he adds a new question. If he could see Krell's corruption, why couldn't he connect those dots sooner? Pattern interrupt. Imagine Rex actually answering Fives in that alley with, "I believe you." We take this straight to Anakin and Ahsoka. That thought haunts him. They were the squad leaders who beat a rogue Jedi once. Could they have done it again against the whole rotten system? He knows the odds were 1,000,000 to 1, but clones are trained to fight impossible odds. That's the survivor's guilt he carries now. At the same time, Umbara gives him a strange sliver of solace. As I said, he's not just running from what he did, he's holding on to what he refused to do. On that shadow world, he drew a line, and clones across the galaxy heard about it. Rumors of a captain who arrested his own general spread through mess halls and barracks. When Order 66 hits, a few more troopers hesitate for half a second, because they remember Rex proving that orders are not sacred. When Rex later sits with Ahsoka on the transport after the chips are removed, or with rebels years down the timeline, he doesn't tell the Umbara story as some heroic war story. I thought it would be fun to say he brags about it, but of course he doesn't. He talks about Krell the way old clones talk about the good old days, on Kamino, except his version is a warning. Institutions can look noble, armor can shine, and the Jedi crest can be stamped on every briefing, but rot can still sit right at the top. So there's your warning embedded in his character. Rex isn't just a veteran out of time, he's a living archive of what it costs to say no once, and then fail to say it again. Now, let's get started on how that archive shapes the next generation of fighters who decide they won't repeat his mistakes. Now that Rex's story has been turned into this living archive, we can zoom out and look at the bigger timeline. Umbara isn't just a brutal campaign anymore, it becomes a recorded case study. Krell's trial is on the books. Testimony from clones, Jedi, and even Kaminoan observers gets stored in Dusty Republic and later Imperial databases. Historians and future rebels can literally pull up a file that shows a Jedi general going dark and a clone captain refusing to follow him into the abyss. That single record already cracks Palpatine's favorite story. The Empire loves to say the Jedi were traitors and the clones were loyal tools, full stop. But now, there will be major spoilers for that propaganda. So, there's your warning. When you have an official transcript of Jedi corruption exposed by clones, the narrative gets messy. It's no longer, the Jedi all betrayed us, or the clones just followed orders. It's, the Order had blind spots, and the clones sometimes saw them first. From there, the story leaks out of the archives and into cantinas. Surviving troopers from the 501st, from Umbara, from later episodes of the war, tell the same tale in a dozen different ways. They were pinned down in the mist, Krell kept throwing them at Umbaran guns, and one captain finally said no. Over time, the captain who said no and the general who fell becomes a kind of trench legend, traded in rebel cells next to stories about Heavy's sacrifice, or Fives running through Coruscant shouting about chips. I thought it would be fun to imagine how that hits the Force-sensitive survivors. A kid who discovers they're strong in the Force decades later doesn't just hear that the Jedi were noble guardians cut down in their prime. They also hear that the Order nearly lost itself to the war, that one of their own generals turned Krell dark, and that non-Force users had to pull them back. As I said, that changes who they see as heroes. It's not just Yoda and Kenobi, it's Rex and every nameless trooper who backed his stand. Eventually, that filters into how the Jedi are rebuilt. When someone tries to restart the Order, Umbara is required reading. Krell becomes an institutional ghost story. The general who treated clones as expendable, trusted the war machine more than the Force, and paid for it. Rex becomes the moral counterweight, the clone who remembered that conscience outranks rank. The new Jedi are more humble, more wary of becoming generals first and guardians second, because there's a documented moment where that went horribly wrong. So Umbara turns into a pivot point in galactic myth. In this version of the timeline, it's not just a foggy battlefield, it's the proof that even inside massive systems, Kaminoan breeding vats, Jedi hierarchies, Imperial propaganda, individuals can still torque history off its rails. And now, let's get started on what happens when that myth collides with the Emperor's final plans, and the clones aren't as programmable as he counted on. Now that we've seen how Umbara turns into this huge galactic myth, we need to zoom back in on one man standing in the fog and saying a single dangerous word: no. Because when Rex refuses Krell in this version of the timeline, he doesn't just change a battle, he rewrites who he is. First, let's talk about what he actually gains. The obvious one is brutal and simple: lives. Those frontal assaults, the keep charging until the guns jam orders, the friendly fire trap that, in canon, wipes out whole squads of 501st clones. In this what if, Rex cuts that off early. Hundreds of brothers who were statistics on Krell's report now walk away from Umbara with scorch marks instead of body bags. Fives doesn't have to drag more dead troopers into cover while muttering that the general has lost it. But it's more than numbers. Refusing Krell forces Rex to finally line up his blaster with his moral compass. He's always been the clone who customizes his armor, who says things like, "I follow orders, but I also follow my own judgment." Here, he proves it. When he stands his ground, Ahsoka, Anakin, and even Echo eventually see that this isn't a glitch in clone conditioning. It's leadership. That deepens the trust later on, when Ahsoka needs someone to believe her against the entire Republic, and when Rex needs someone to believe him about chips and conspiracies. As I said, this is where his legacy shifts from good soldier to the captain who put conscience over protocol. Of course, that kind of stand comes with a price tag. By saying no once, Rex can never fully go back to the comfort of simple obedience. He loses that unquestioned belonging in the chain of command, the feeling that if he just does what the Jedi say, he's clean. Some Jedi will look at him and see fives with rank, a potential mutineer in blue paint. There are quiet conversations in council chambers about captains who think too much, and a few generals who stop requesting the 501st because they don't want to be the next Krell. Psychologically, being the first is its own battlefield. Rex becomes living proof that clones can defy a Jedi and be right. That empowers him, but it also isolates him. Other captains whisper, "You really told a general no?" with this mix of awe and terror, the same way clones joked about Heavy's last stand or 99 grabbing a rifle. He carries survivor's guilt for the brothers he still couldn't save, and a new kind of guilt for the Jedi careers and reputations shattered by his report. And when the war eventually ends, this decision doesn't stay on Umbara. It follows him into every quiet moment. Rex isn't just a veteran fishing on some backwater with Ahsoka dropping in for a visit. He's the man who once put his entire life, his rank, and his identity as property of the Republic on the line for a principle. That makes it harder for him to accept any new regime at face value. When an empire rises and a new set of orders comes in, he's already the clone who proved orders can be wrong. Now, there will be major spoilers for where that leads, so there's your warning. The first time Rex says no to a Jedi sets up the moment he has to decide what to do when every clone around him turns on the Jedi at once. And this time, the order isn't coming from Krell. So that brings us to the big question. Could one word on Umbara really change the Clone Wars? Could Rex looking Krell in the eye and saying no actually move the needle in a galaxy that's basically rigged from the start? We have to be honest about the constraints of this universe. The inhibitor chips are still in every clone's head. Palpatine is still 10 steps ahead of everyone, playing Dejarik while the Jedi are playing Dejarik badly. The war machine is massive, and one captain on one shadowy planet is not going to magically stop Order 66 or erase the Empire from the timeline. Now, there will be major spoilers for the rest of the war, so there's your warning. But within those limits, Rex refusing Krell is actually one of the most plausible and impactful divergence points we could pick. Rex is already unusually independent for a clone. He customizes his armor, he questions orders, and he has that personal code that we see with Cut Lawquane, with Ahsoka, and with Fives. Pair that with Krell's orders, which are so extreme that even obedient clones flinch, and you get a pressure cooker where no doesn't feel out of character at all. As I said, the war on a galactic scale probably snaps back toward canon. Sidious still issues Order 66. The chips still fire. The Jedi Temple still burns. Rex still has to carve his helmet open and rip that chip out with Ahsoka. The Empire rises because that plan is baked in years before Umbara, and no single battle, no matter how brutal, is going to unwind that. But the meaning of the war around that fixed outcome can change a lot. If Rex refuses Krell earlier, clone culture shifts. The 501st see that a captain can stand up to a Jedi general and live. So, good soldiers follow orders, stops sounding absolute and starts sounding negotiable. Other squads hear the story. Suddenly, Five's later paranoia about the chips doesn't feel like one trooper going rogue. It feels like the next step in a pattern of clones thinking for themselves. On the Jedi side, Umbara becomes a wound they can't ignore. Instead of brushing off a few bad generals, the Council has to confront that their reliance on the clones and their distance from them let something like Krell happen. We get more self-reflection, more Obi-Wan and Plo Koon-style commanders actually listening when clones push back. So, does Umbara stop the Empire? No. But it changes how people understand the war and their role in it, and that can echo into little pockets of resistance, deserters, and veterans who don't buy the Imperial line at face value. Now let's get started, setting up the final recap with one last question. In a galaxy this rigged, is changing hearts and minds just as important as changing events? So, as I said, if hearts and minds matter, then we should walk through how this alternate Umbara actually plays out from start to finish. I thought it would be fun to do one clean timeline sweep so we can see exactly what Rex changes, and what even he can't touch. Now let's get started back on the gunships over Umbara. Rex is already tired, already scarred by years of war, but still the good soldier who believes in the Republic. Krell arrives, takes command from Anakin, and from the first march through the fog, we see the friction. Reckless charges, no intel, clones treated as numbers. In canon, he goes along. Here, those doubts build faster with every body bag. The divergence hits when Krell orders that full frontal assault we know is a death sentence. This time, Rex refuses. He cites regs, offers an alternate plan, and when Krell doubles down, Rex locks the squad up around him instead of locking his conscience away. The 500 Verst swings into a flanking, cover-heavy advance, using ATRTs and captured tech. They still bleed, but dozens, maybe hundreds, don't die in that first meat grinder. From there, the campaign bends hard. Krell keeps pushing, but now every outrageous command is logged, questioned, and quietly reworked by Rex, Fives, Kix, and the other veterans. The friendly fire ambush never happens because Rex refuses to move his men without positive ID. Instead of clones gunning down clones, they expose Krell's sabotage in real time, catching Umbaran infiltrators and recording Krell's refusal to adapt. That leads straight into the exposure and capture. Dogma is still shaken, but instead of blindly executing for Krell, he's the one who helps slap binders on him when the general ignites both sabers against his own troops. We still get that chilling march through the corridors, but this time, Krell is marched into a field tribunal, not a secret firing squad. Holograms of Jedi Masters, a Senate observer, and even a representative from Palpatine's office watch as clone testimony brings down a Jedi general. Now there will be major spoilers for the rest of the war, so there's your warning. That moment ripples everywhere. Ahsoka hears about it, and her respect for Rex crystallizes into a real partnership. Fives' later investigation into the inhibitor chips gets more traction because clones have already proven they can be right when a Jedi is wrong. Across the army, squads start practicing thoughtful obedience, quoting Rex almost the way they quote, "Good soldiers follow orders." So when Order 66 hits, the chips still fire, but that culture of questioning slows some triggers. Ahsoka reaches Rex faster because she already trusts his judgment. A few more commanders hesitate, a few more troopers miss their shots on purpose, and scattered survivors slip through the cracks, remembering Umbara. In the end, this timeline gives us a galaxy where the Clone Wars aren't just Jedi versus Sith on a holomap. They were also about clones shaping the moral landscape, with Rex standing right at the center of that story. And that brings us right back to Rex himself. When we imagine this alternate Umbara timeline where he refuses Krell on day 1, what we're really doing is putting a spotlight on traits that are already there in canon. Rex isn't suddenly brave or suddenly thoughtful. He's always been the clone who stands a little straighter, thinks a little longer, and carries the weight of the whole squad on his shoulders. As I said, from the very first season, we see that courage and independent thought. This is the guy who customizes his armor, who questions tactics even when Anakin is in charge, and who walks out into enemy fire to pull wounded troopers back to safety. On Umbara, every hesitation, every tight jaw when Krell throws clones into meat grinder assaults, is Rex's conscience trying to push through the conditioning. Our what if just removes a few of those hesitations and lets that conscience speak sooner. Now, there will be major spoilers for the rest of Rex's timeline, so there's your warning. Even without this earlier refusal, Rex still eventually stands up to Krell in canon. He lowers his blaster when he realizes he's been ordered to execute his own men, he joins Fives and the others in exposing Krell's treason, and he helps arrest a Jedi general. Later, during Order 66, he literally fights his own programming, tears off his helmet, and begs Ahsoka to help him. That's not a different character from the one we're imagining here. It's the same man, just taking a few more brutal steps to get there. The Umbara arc is already about the tension between loyalty and morality. On one side, you have the regs drilled into the clones. Obey the Jedi, follow orders, win the war. On the other side, you have the reality of watching your brothers die in senseless charges while a general treats them as expendable numbers. Our scenario doesn't invent that conflict. It just turns the dial up and asks, what if the moment of saying no came before the friendly fire massacre instead of after it? I thought it would be fun to go back to those episodes with that lens. Watch the way Rex looks at Krell when he first arrives, the way he pauses before repeating orders, the way he keeps checking on Fives and the rest of the squad. Those tiny beats feel now like glimpses of the Rex who could have refused sooner, the same clone who will eventually pull his pistols on clones in blue paint, rather than let Ahsoka die. Now, let's get started on seeing what that means for clones in general, because when we treat this as more than just a tactical what-if, it becomes an invitation to see every trooper on Umbara as a full character. They were never just white armor in the smoke. They were people making impossible choices. And if Rex could bend the timeline with one decision, what does that say about all the other clones whose choices we barely noticed? So now it's your turn to step into the mud on Umbara with us. We've walked through how one decision from Rex could bend the whole timeline, but that only matters if we're clear on the core dilemma. In a war built on hierarchy and obedience, was Rex morally obligated to refuse Krell's orders much earlier, or was the stand he eventually took enough? As I said, this is more than a tactical question about flanking maneuvers and supply lines. This is about what loyalty actually means for clones who were literally bred to follow orders. Rex customizes his armor. He pauses before executing questionable commands. He lectures Fives about discipline in one episode, and then quietly breaks the rules in another. So, there's your warning. It's not a simple, good soldier follows orders situation here. Now, there will be major spoilers for how we judge him. If you look at this altered Umbara, Rex's refusal saves lives, exposes Krell's corruption way sooner, and forces the Jedi Council to confront what's happening in their own ranks. That sounds heroic, but do you think those benefits outweigh the risk of destabilizing the chain of command in the middle of an already chaotic campaign? If every captain started saying no, how long before the whole war effort falls apart? I thought it would be fun to treat the comments as our own in-universe ethics council. Picture Shaak Tay, Obi-Wan, Plo Koon, and a very unimpressed Mace Windu sitting there while we debate what to do with Captain Rex after Umbara in this scenario. Would you court-martial him for insubordination, promote him for moral courage, or quietly sideline him to keep things stable while still admitting he was right? Now, let's get started with some specific prompts. If you were on the Jedi Council reading Rex's after-action report, how would you vote? Guilty of endangering the war effort, or justified because Krell had already fallen? And be concrete. Tell us if you'd pin a medal on him, send him to the brig, or pull a very Jedi move and say, you are forgiven, but you cannot serve on the front lines anymore. Pattern interrupt for you. What if Rex isn't even the first to say no? In your version, does Fives snap earlier and force Rex's hand? Does Dogma, the good soldier, break first when Krell orders something truly horrific? Or do you have Rex arresting Krell the moment he steps off the gunship, long before the friendly fire massacre can ever happen? Use the comments to lay out your own alternate beats. Name the clones, describe the scene, quote the lines. Of course, we're building a fun what-if, but we're also testing where you draw the line between loyalty to the Republic and loyalty to your squad. Because once we know how you judge Rex on Umbara, we can start asking what that means for Order 66, and that's where we're heading next. So, where does all of this leave us? We just spent an entire episode spinning out an alternate timeline from one captain, one word, on one nightmare world. Rex standing on the Umbaran front, hearing Krell's order, and choosing no instead of yes, doesn't just save a few squads. It reshapes trust, it reshapes command, and it reshapes what the clones believe they're allowed to be. As I said, the emotional core of this what-if isn't just tactics. It's that moment where duty slams into conscience and a single clone refuses to be a number. On Umbara, Rex is already decorated, already respected, already the guy who paints tally marks on his helmet and personalizes his armor. Now, there will be major spoilers for how we think about him going forward, so there's your warning. Once you've imagined this version of Rex, the canon one on Umbara feels a lot more tragic. I thought it would be fun to turn this into a full campaign, not just a one-off. So, now let's get started on the next mission together. In the comments, tell me what branch of the Clone Wars you want to explore next. Do we follow Fives off Kamino in a world where he survives and actually convinces someone on Coruscant? Do we stay with the 5 hunt first and ask what happens if Ahsoka never leaves the Order and is right there when the chips activate? Or do we zoom out and say the Kaminoans, Shaak Ty, Or even Rex himself discovered the inhibitor chips before the war ends, forcing Palpatine to change the entire play. Everyone wrote Domino Squad off once, and they were wrong. In this series, we're not writing any clone off. Use the comments to pitch full episodes. Name the clones, call out the exact episode you'd diverge from, tell me which scene you'd pause and say, if he just said this one different word, everything changes. Of course, the more specific you are, the easier it is to build a clean alternate timeline we can walk through from start to finish. If you want to keep remapping the war from the clones' point of view, subscribing isn't just some generic button press. Think of it as signing up with a new squad, one whose whole job is to debrief the battles the show didn't have time to cover. Hit the bell so you get called up every time we drop another operation file, whether that's Fives on Coruscant, Ahsoka in the Temple, or Rex staring down Order 66 with a different history behind his eyes. Because behind every armor plate is a person like Rex, Fives, Echo, or Cut-Up, and reimagining their choices is one way of honoring how rich and complex the Clone Wars really is. In a galaxy that tried to turn them into numbers, the clones still found ways to say no. The only question is, how early and at what cost?